Bafundi, let's look at this alteration. This is quite an interesting one. I haven't actually seen the style before of how they did the semi-lining here. So it's lined all the way up to here. Stitch obviously on the inside here. That's not too exciting. Look how they've done this vent. They've actually stitched it here. So you've got a top stitch here on the outside of the vent. And that then folds neatly over like that. Very, very nice. So for this gentleman, he's lost a lot of weight. And we're going to take a little bit out the back here. Now, where possible, I don't come to the vent. I don't take more than 1.5 centimeters here because then like the vent looks very strange. But in this case, we're actually taking in all the way into the vent, and we're then going to just shift the vent a little bit further back. Going to redo that whole section. And for this gent as well, we're taking in here in the front, on this front side. This one is a very challenging alteration, and especially you can't take more. I don't like to take more than 1.5, because of course you can't go past the pocket. So then you'll end up, this is nice and tight around the chest, and then all of a sudden hereby is hips. He's got this massive bubble over the pocket. Absolute disaster. And of course, this is where the clients really trust us to say, we can only do so much on this jacket, and this is what we're going to do. If you want more than that, you need to go to another tailor who's going to really wreck this jacket. We won't do that for you. So that's what we're going to do today. We're just taking in over here and here at the back. So I've already unpicked a little bit on this side so we can give it a look. Okay, look here. We're really just going to take that seam in equally on both sides, and then we'll be shifting that vent over. I'm going to have to figure out exactly what I do with this lining, but perhaps we just keep it exactly like that. I don't like to cut where it's not 100% necessary, and actually we might be able to do that. Here I'm not sure if I'll be able to stitch that again, or what we'll do, or if we'll just by hand maybe reconnect that. We'll see when we get there. Now here in the underarm, also, like I was saying, I don't like to do more than 1.5. In this case, we're doing 1 because, I know that I don't like to do 1.5. Like for me, it's on the edge. And also, if you look at this seam or this join, this is usually unequal there, you see. So, of course, the more that you take in here, the more unequal this seam gets, and actually the lower the armhole goes, which ends up being tighter. Because then you can't really lift your arm. It's like stuck over here. So, 1 centimeter, we're going to be able to still to keep it reasonably round. 1.5, really at the max. If you get to 2, this becomes quite hectic. I have in the past just been very crazy and taken or put an extra seam in there where it's more flat here. You can do that. I obviously prefer not to, but it's really not a crime if you're going to put that in there, especially it's under the arm. You won't really see it. So, of course, the number one thing I'm going to do is go and iron all of this and then mark up my alterations. Then we'll do the stitching, and from there, obviously, fun unpicking. Let's take a look. Where are we? What has happened? All right, so here, side back, did that alteration there, and I've already ironed it. Now here into the seam where it joins here with the armhole, I really don't like to start less than 4 centimeters below that join. 3 centimeters you can do, but it's a squeeze. You see here already I had to just cut the seam allowance a little bit so that I can actually get in there and do this alteration. Now, like I said, generally I don't like to actually change the vent, but in this case we're changing it. Usually I like whatever measurement was here at the top of the vent, we just carry that straight down. But this chap's vents themselves were actually at an angle. So in this case, here at the top is 2, here at the bottom it's 2.5. And I think I'm just going to leave that whole portion in there. I'm just going to now stitch that, one time together, get a letter edge there, even though this is quite broad, no one's going to die. Here you see they actually didn't have any fusing originally. They only had some fusing here. So I just put a fuse there so that can fold neatly on that line. Here we may as well do this while we're at it. Let's see. So we take the measure of the hem, which is 375. Draw that up, 375. Measurement of this, which is 8. Draw that up. This I've done before, I think, somewhere on the channel. But you know, always helps to repeat things. You never know what you're going to learn. So basically, you want to know if you folded this, where would that corner be? Okay. After got distracted by the client. So yes, we want to know where that point is. And then perpendicular to this line of the hem, passing through this point, we need to know where is that edge. Perpendicular on this line of the vent, passing through that point. We need to know where is that point. We need to know where is the corner. And we need to join these three. And this will give you the perfect letter edge no matter what shape you're on. And then of course you're just kind of joining those two lines there. So now while I was ironing, I was thinking about my life and trying to figure out how I'm going to proceed with this side. Okay. Obviously I'll do that same. Okay, so the side, theoretically, I could just, this is folded under and I can just stitch that one time. There's just a notch there. That gets stitched up. I could actually just keep all of that exactly as it is. The question is whether or not the seam allowance is going to pull in a strange way. Okay, now I've pinned that. So I'm just going to pin that there to flatten that. Yeah, I don't know, because you see here, the seam allowance is now too much. So yeah, no, it's actually not going to work. So I'm going to have to trim this down, but then I don't think it will be such a drama to, again, just kind of stitch that, flip it under and stitch this down. So let me do that. Where's my chalk now? So the original stitch line here was 1 centimeter. We're going to do 1.5. Just marking 1.5, 1.5. I'm just going to trim that stitch line, that seam allowance down. Coming in here with a diagonal notch from the vent. And what I'm going to do is actually, when I get back to the iron, give this seam allowance a bit of a stretch. What fabric is this? Should have checked that before I started working on it, but is this bad? It looks like it says 100% wool. It's quite faded. But if it's a wool, we'll be able to stretch that out nicely, and then the seam allowance will lie nicely over there. And then we'll figure out what we're going to do for this to just stitch that closed. My personal style, what I do is I actually have that gouache, just finishing on a raw edge there, and then I bind that seam one time all the way into the vent. But of course, this is an alteration. We need to replicate the original. Here on the underarm, obviously I unpicked and ironed it flat. And you can see there's that little mismatch there. But because it's not too much, we're going to be able to preserve the original stitch line. So here's the original stitch line, and I'm just going to smooth that in there. So this seam allowance will be like 0.5 centimeter. So maybe I'll come down a little bit, just so it's maybe 7 mils. Smooth that in. But of course now, next question is on the sleeve. What is happening? And generally the same amount that you took from the underarm here you're going to take out of the sleeve. I always just pin it and double check. So let's see if we get in here in the sleeve. Because of that curve, it's really difficult to say accurately what will be the effect on the sleeve. So I'm just going to pin that at a 1 centimeter alteration as if I had stitched that. Again, with the sleeve, it's not a straight line. You can see there, my seam allowances are going to be mismatched. But now if I stitch that, and I come back here, will this sit in smoothly? Yeah, and that's going to be fine. That's going to sit smoothly. Like I said, I'm going to kind of make that stitch as smooth as possible, even if here I only stitch maybe like 7 moles on this side panel. So I did forget to iron these seams when I was at the iron, so I'm going to do that. Take an alteration there, 1 centimeter, probably down to about 10 or 15 centimeters. Also here, on this part of the lining, took 1 centimeter here, but didn't go all the way down like I did on the outside body. I stopped maybe around here because it's a lining, one's going to die. But let's go and do all of that. Yeah, with polyester or cotton, it's difficult to stretch out your fabric, but yeah, I was able to just stretch that. And what I'm going to do is just overlock this and just top stitch this straight on. Of course, this is then going to be a little bit looser than usual, but at the end of the day, it's still going to be fashion. It's not like we took 7 centimeters off. Here, the original, it was just, they had a stitch running here. Personally, I think I'm just going to hand stitch up along the edge there just to keep that in place. And you can see here how that leather edge came out. It always matches there perfectly. Goes all the way to the edge, always matches there perfectly. That is the power of maths, in this case geometry. So then here on the sleeve, I did iron that, stitch that a centimeter down. Now I'm going to go ahead and iron that open so that we can get in here and just restitch that, keeping it smooth so we don't have like some weird bump. And yeah, as I've been saying repeatedly, maybe leaving a portion of it just at like a 7 moles seam allowance. So here you can see also the lining, everything kind of gets done in one. Not really, but you have to get the lining out of the way to stitch here, and then we'll put the lining back in. This I usually just close by hand. I don't really want to struggle over there. This also lets me secure this lining there as I work. But let's not stress too much about that right now. What I'm going to do then is overlock that and iron this portion of the sleeve open and the lining open there. You see how I did there? Just flipped it around. Let's just look at that. So see, there's my sleeve. That's ironed open. And then here, you can just flip it through that little portion. And then you can work on the lining and on the sleeve there. Easy peasy. It's not too much revolutionary happening here. Like I said, I overlock that. And then here, I'm just going to stitch this top stitch, this lining, onto here. And like I said, here it is going to be a little bit baggy, but no one will die. Here you can see I stitched the sleeve onto the body. And obviously you must check this portion here, that there's no like weird kinks or bits of the seam allowance showing here. This all looks fine. Now you can one time sew the lining, this portion of the lining, one time. But what happens then is that you'll get, let me put a pin there. If I sewed it one time, your stitch line on the lining would be down there, which isn't a crime, but your sleeve lining would then stop over here. So you'll just see like a random stitch line there. Like I say, no one's going to die. However, if you stitch the body one time and then the sleeve, you do that top stitch separately at 0.5 centimeter. Then you also have a nice guide of where this sleeve lining must come. And then this I do by hand. I don't know any other way to do it. I don't think I can actually get in there by machine. So we stitch that by hand, stitch this by machine, and then here, this whole section, from here, from this corner back to that corner, I'll do by hand just with a very, very fine prick stitch, just catching this all in place like that for the vent. And then we'll be done. We'll have altered the underarm front and the side, redoing or moving the vents. It's a pretty complex job. It's all of that's been done up. Here, just by hand, nothing too exciting. And of course, I always like to check things on the mannequin. So you can see here, it is lying smooth. There's no weird bubbles there. Like I was saying, if you take that in too much, this ends up being too poofy around the hips here. And of course here, I can quickly see there while I was working, I ironed in some creases. So I'm going to have to sort that out. And then also at the back, you can check, is it lying nice and smooth here? Here you can see it's kind of gathering a little bit in like that, but this is because this mannequin is not nearly the size. There, that's what we're actually looking for. And we are, now going to fit, but you can see these vents are just lying smoothly there. They're not pulling somewhere funny. And that's that, altering the side front and the back all the way through the vents. Glad you're there.